It was the spring of 1949. 2.5 years since a woman walking her child down Norton Avenue in Los Angeles thought she'd seen a department store mannequin in the weeds. 2.5 years since the case had stopped moving. I worked the pacifier between my teeth and looked at the file. Here's what I knew. January 15th, 1947. A clear, cold Wednesday morning. A neighborhood in southwest Los Angeles called Leimert Park, then mostly fields and half-built houses. A woman named Betty Bersinger walking with her 3-year-old at about 10 in the morning. A vacant lot at the corner of 39th and Norton. In that lot, lying in the weeds about a foot from the sidewalk, the body of a young woman. She had been killed somewhere else. She had been brought to that lot afterward and laid out where she'd be found. She had been cut in half at the waist. Her name was Elizabeth Short. She was 22 years old. She had moved to Los Angeles from Massachusetts a few months earlier, hoping to break into the movies. The newspapers, working from a story they couldn't fully verify, gave her a nickname based on a film noir then in theaters. They called her the Black Dahlia. By the end of January, the LAPD had over 150 suspects. By February, the trail was cold. By 1949, when a county grand jury reviewed the case to find out why nobody had been arrested, the answer was simple. There just wasn't enough. That's what everybody knew. What was bothering me was what everybody didn't. 3 things since the first week. The cuts. Whoever killed her hadn't cut her up because he was angry. He'd cut her up because he knew how. The body had been bisected through a single specific spot between 2 vertebrae of the lower spine that doctors learn about in their 2nd year. That isn't rage, that's training, the blood. There wasn't any. Not at the scene, not in the body. Whoever had killed her had drained her, washed her, and posed her. He had taken his time. And the letters. 9 days after the body was found, somebody mailed the police her address book and her birth certificate, with a note made of newspaper clippings. He kept writing. Then, after a couple of months, he stopped. The girl out front set a folder on the desk and walked back out. A copy of an old LAPD bulletin, the kind of thing that got handed around between detectives off the books. Somebody had finally pulled it for me. I bit down on the pacifier and turned to the first page. Start with the morning. Wednesday, January 15th, 1947. About 10 a.m. Mrs. Betty Bersinger of South Norton Avenue left her house with her 3-year-old to walk a few blocks to a shoe shop. Leimert Park in 1947 wasn't quite a neighborhood yet. The big developers had drawn lines on a map and built some streets, but a lot of the lots were still empty. Weeds, patchy grass, plywood signs advertising houses that hadn't been built. Mrs. Bersinger was walking past one of those vacant lots when she saw something white in the weeds, about a foot off the sidewalk. Her first thought was that somebody had thrown out a department store mannequin. She kept walking. Then she stopped. She picked up her daughter. She walked to the nearest house. She asked the woman who answered if she could use the phone. What the patrol officers found, 20 minutes later, was a young woman. She was naked. She had been cut in half at the waist. The 2 halves had been placed about 10 inches apart, oriented the same direction. The killer had posed her. There were cuts on her face. Her mouth slit at both corners, identical in length on each side. There were rope marks on her wrists, ankles, and neck. There were no defensive wounds on her hands. By the time he started cutting her, she had been somewhere else, restrained for a long time. There was no blood at the scene, none on the weeds, none on the dirt, none on her. She had been washed. I sat with that. I worked the pacifier between my teeth and sat with that. Most murderers don't wash the body. Most don't have the time or the place or the temperament. Most want to be done. This one had wanted to make a thing. He'd had her somewhere private. He'd kept her somewhere with running water. He'd cleaned her up. He'd loaded her into a car. He'd driven her to a vacant lot in a half-built suburb in the early hours of a Wednesday morning. That isn't a man losing control. That's a man making a delivery. Before there was a Black Dahlia, there was a girl named Beth. Some people called her Betty. Family called her Betty May. She'd been born Elizabeth Short in Boston in 1924 and had grown up in Medford, Massachusetts, the third of 5 sisters in a house that had lost its father early. Her father had walked out into the cold one morning in 1930, left his car on a bridge over the Charles River, and let everybody think he had jumped. He hadn't. He'd just left. Years later, he wrote his wife from California to ask if he could come back. She said no. He stayed gone. Elizabeth went to find him in 1943. She was 19. She moved to California, lived with him for a while in Vallejo, and then moved out after they fought. She drifted south. She lived in San Diego. She lived in Los Angeles. She bounced between rooming houses, between waitressing jobs that didn't last. She told people she wanted to be in the movies. Whether she ever actually tried to get cast, nobody ever proved. She had the look, pale skin, dark hair, dark clothes, but no resume. She had the look of somebody trying to look like somebody else. In December of 1946, she was living in Hollywood, not making rent. A married salesman named Robert Manley, who'd met her in San Diego, drove her north and dropped her at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles on Friday, January 9th, 1947. Manley walked her to the lobby. He waited with her. She said she was meeting her sister. She made a phone call. She waited. At 10 in the evening, she walked out of the lobby. That was the last verified sighting of Elizabeth Short alive. 6 days later, Mrs. Bersinger was walking past a vacant lot in Leimert Park. 6 days. Sometime in that gap, somewhere within walking distance or driving distance of the Biltmore, somebody had her. Somebody kept her somewhere quiet. Where she went between Friday night and Wednesday morning is the entire case. The LAPD never found out. They never found the room. They never found the bathtub. They never found the car. Back to the body. Because the body is where the genius shows up. The autopsy was done by Frederick Newbar, the LA County Medical Examiner, on January 16th. He'd been a coroner since the 20s. He'd seen everything Los Angeles had to show. This was different. The bisection had been done at the lumbar spine, between the 2nd and 3rd lumbar vertebrae. That's a precise location. That's the spot where the spine has the most natural give. It's the spot they teach in medical schools as the cleanest place to perform what's called a hemicorporectomy, a surgical bisection. Whoever had killed her had known about that spot. The other thing Newbar's report contained: the bisection was performed after death. After death is the part that mattered. She was already dead when he cut her in half. So he hadn't done it to kill her. He'd done it for some other reason. Logistics. A body that comes apart fits in a smaller car. Display. A body in 2 pieces makes a different impression. Theatre. Maybe all of it. I needed something off the top shelf for this one. I wasn't going to get it on my own. The girl out front handed me a clinical reference, the kind they keep in police libraries. She set it on the desk and walked back out. I looked at the diagram and thought about how somebody had ended up holding one. The other thing about the cuts was the cleanness. No hesitation marks, no false starts. The killer had cut her efficiently and stopped when the job was done. That kind of restraint takes practice. people don't do this for the first time and do it well. Which raised the question the LAPD spent 6 weeks chasing. Was he a doctor? In mid-February, the department subpoenaed the student lists from the University of Southern California Medical School, located about 2 miles from the lot where the body had been found. They went through the names. They interviewed faculty. They didn't find anything they could prove. That doesn't mean he wasn't there. It means he was good enough not to leave a track. "9 days after the body was found, the killer mailed the police a package. January 24th, 1947. A postal inspector at the downtown Los Angeles post office stopped a manila envelope in the mail. It had been doused in gasoline to throw off police dogs, the killer apparently believed, and addressed in cut-out newspaper letters glued to the front. To the Los Angeles Examiner, here is Dahlia's belongings, letter to follow. Inside the envelope, Elizabeth Short's birth certificate, her social security card, photographs from her purse, her address book, with one page torn out. That last detail is the one that mattered. The address book contained the names of dozens of men she'd known. The killer had taken one page. Whoever was on it had been worth removing. More letters came over the following weeks. Each one was made of cut-out newspaper letters glued to paper. Each one was signed in different ways. Sometimes the Black Dahlia Avenger, sometimes nothing at all. One of them said, "I will give up on Dahlia killing if I get 10 years. Don't try to find me." Another announced a meeting with police that the writer never attended. And then, in early March, the letters stopped. They never came back. That part is what I kept coming back to. Most men who write letters like that keep writing them. The compulsion that gets them started doesn't run out. The Zodiac wrote letters for 5 years after his last confirmed murder. The Dahlia killer wrote for about 6 weeks. Then he was done. Either he died or was incarcerated for something unrelated or moved away. Or he stopped because he'd never needed to write the letters in the first place, because the letters weren't part of the compulsion. They were part of a plan. A man who needs to brag keeps bragging. A man who's running a misdirection writes for as long as the misdirection is useful, and then stops. I don't know which one he was. I do know that whoever read the letters at the LAPD never figured it out either. By the end of February of 47, the LAPD had 150 suspects. By the time the grand jury reviewed the case in 49, it was up to 192. The LAPD's actual shortlist, the one they kept in a different folder than the public one, had names on it. One of them you might have heard. The man's name was George Hodel. He was a doctor, a successful one. He ran a venereal disease clinic in downtown Los Angeles in the 1940s. He had a Hollywood Hills mansion designed by Frank Lloyd Wright's son. He threw parties. He had also, in 1949, been tried in Los Angeles Superior Court for the alleged sexual abuse of his teenage daughter, Tamar. He was acquitted, and in early 1950, 11 months after the acquittal, the LAPD bugged his house. The wiretap ran for several weeks. It produced hundreds of pages of transcripts, most of them tedious. But on one of those tapes, recorded inside Hodel's home, the doctor was heard to say, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They can't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary anymore because she's dead." That's not a confession. Defense lawyers will tell you that. A statement that begins with "supposing" is rhetorical. Maybe. Or maybe he was a man at home, alone, 6 weeks after the LAPD had questioned him for a third time, talking about the case the way men in trouble talk about a thing, with a shrug in the voice, with the kind of half-smile that lives between confession and contempt. I've heard a lot of recordings of men in trouble. The men who didn't do it sound annoyed. The men who did it sound amused. Hodel sounded amused. There were 6 things on the LAPD's list that matched Hodel. 1, he had medical training, surgical specifically. First in his class at the University of California, San Francisco Medical School in 1936. 2, his clinic had a rear entrance and a private back room. 3, his secretary, Ruth Spaulding, had died of an overdose in 1945. Hodel had been alone with her at the time. 4, handwriting. Hodel's known handwriting had similarities to the cut-out letters mailed to the papers. 5, 5-pound bags of concrete had been found near where Elizabeth's body had been dumped. Hodel had purchased 5-pound bags of concrete from a Los Angeles hardware store a few weeks before the murder. The receipts existed. 6, the recording. None of those things individually would have convicted George Hodel. Together, though, they painted something. Hodel was never arrested for the Dahlia killing. By the end of 50, he had moved to the Philippines. He stayed abroad for the rest of his life. Years later, his son Steve, a former LAPD detective, would publish a book naming his own father as the killer. The book's title used a phrase that I'd been carrying around for years, too. A genius for murder. Steve wasn't wrong about the genius part. 12 men were on that list, and 12 men had reasons to be there, and the LAPD never closed the loop on any of them. That isn't the part that bothered me most. The part that bothered me most was that there were 12 men who had reasons to be on a list at all. 12 men in one city. 12 men who knew enough, were violent enough, were strange enough, that an LAPD detective in 1947 had reason to write down their name and underline it twice. Los Angeles in 1947 was full of men like that. Elizabeth Short walked through it for 6 months. There are versions of the story that say Hodel had friends in the LAPD who protected him. There are versions that say the case was just too cold by 1950, too far gone that no district attorney would have prosecuted on a bug tape with no body and no confession. There are versions where a man with money and reach in 1950 Los Angeles could simply step out of a thing if he wanted to. He had the money, he had the reach, he stepped out. I sat with the folder open, I closed it, I opened it again. I'd been told once that I didn't always look the part. I let people keep thinking that. The case wasn't going to end with George Hodel. He was a name, not the name. We will never know, for court, with proof, whether he was the man. What we know is that somewhere in Los Angeles in early 1947, somebody very much like him had a quiet room and ran water and waited. Somebody walked away clean. The case didn't end in the spring of '49. I kept the file on my desk. I kept it there a long time. By the early 50s, the case had passed out of the active rotation. Detectives who'd worked on it retired. Boxes of evidence got shelved, then moved, then partly lost. The Hodel wiretap recording disappeared somewhere along the way. The transcripts survived. In 1999, George Hodel died. He had spent the last 50 years of his life mostly outside the United States. In 2003, his son Steve published his book. The LAPD reviewed Steve's evidence. They did not announce a conclusion. The book sold. Other books followed. Other suspects were named. The case is still open. In the 78 years since Mrs. Bersinger walked past a vacant lot at 39th and Norton, the LAPD has named hundreds of suspects, eliminated most of them, and arrested none. The body has stayed buried in Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland. Elizabeth's mother lived another 30 years and went to her own grave without an answer. The address book page has never been found. The room she was kept in has never been found. The car she was moved in has never been found. Somebody in 1947 cleaned up after himself, the way men clean up after themselves when they've planned for it. Somebody walked away clean. And somewhere in this case is a fact that I never put together. Somewhere in the file is a name we already had, attached to a fact we already had, and the connection that mattered was too small for any of us to see. Genius isn't a magic trick. It's just somebody being more patient than the people looking for him. I closed the folder. There are cases that end. There are cases that close. And there are cases that just stop being worked. Elizabeth Short walked out of the lobby of the Biltmore Hotel at 10 in the evening on January 9th, 1947. And somewhere in the next 6 days, a man who had thought everything through took her somewhere private and finished what he had started in his head a long time before. We never found him. The file closed the way files close. Not clean, just closed. Case closed. End of script.